This is City and State TV. I'm Albany reporter Matt Hamilton, and I have with me Assemblyman Steve McLaughlin. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
So first I'd like to start out talking about the governor's race at this point. You know, at the beginning of the year, your name was mentioned here or there, and now it kind of looks like we're with Rob Astorino or Donald Trump. Tell me a little bit about what you know about the two men, your relations with them, and tell me, you know, who you think might be better for the state.
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, from my perspective, I've decided that at this point, it's highly unlikely that I'll run. It's just such a difficult task to raise the money and you know, I've got two kids getting ready to go to college. To take a year away from them at this point would be very difficult on the family. So I've decided more than likely I'm not running at this point. I know Rob Astorino very well. I've had great conversations with Rob. I've never met Donald Trump. I would like to meet him someday. I'm sure a lot of people would like to meet him. I've never had the pleasure. But I would think either one of those candidates would be strong candidates for the office of Governor of New York State. I've had extensive conversations with Rob, and I know he's of the same mindset. And from what I've read and listened to Donald Trump, the positions are very much the same. So I think at this point we'll have to just wait and see how that all shakes out.
I don't know if it's necessarily a 50-50 split, but there seem to be some Republicans who would want to back Trump, others that would like to back Rob. In the end, what do you see as the future? I mean, what do you make of this kind of split, if you will? In the end, do you think that Republicans will back whoever the state party ends up backing?
Well, I do, and I think that the splits are nothing new. I mean, you go through, a lot of times the Democrats will go through a primary, the Republicans will go through a primary. That's common. I mean, that's just politics the way it is. You have a lot of people that are seeking one position. You're going to have some splits. Ultimately, I do hope, and I've said all along, that what we need is unity. We have to have a unified ticket, whoever that is, and you know, whether it was me or whether it was somebody else, the unity is really, really important, because the truth is, whether that's a Republican or a Democrat in the governor's office, the incumbents always have a big advantage. And then you add to that a governor that's sitting on $33 million as he complains that there's too much money in politics, which is just a little ironic. But you know, he's out there with a lot of money, so unity is vital. And I hope and I think that at the end of the day, we're going to have unity going forward, and that means the Republican and the conservative lines, and hopefully the independent line as well. You never know how that's going to play out also. So that's key in this whole process, is that we have unity and focus on what's really important, which is removing Andrew Cuomo from the governor's office.
You're an Upstate representative. You know the Upstate community very well. Where do you think the Upstate vote lies, whether it's Republican or Democrat, moving forward?
Well, I think it's going to be split, just like it will be downstate. I mean, there's certainly folks upstate that are dyed-in-the-wool Democrats and dyed-in-the-wool Republicans. That's just kind of the way things are. I think that there is a great story to be told here for the Republican candidate to get out there and say, look, take a look at what's going on. I mean, just today, yesterday, almost every day, there's new news about New York State. As I always say, that we're at the bottom of every good list, we're at the top of every bad list. And just the other day, we had another list come out and say that we are dead last in business friendliness, we're the worst tax climate. So there's a real narrative that can be told to the people of New York. I do believe, though, that upstate New York will go very strongly Republican in this next election cycle. I honestly think that the Republican candidate's probably going to win 50 to 55 counties upstate. The key to the race, though, is to do very well in Long Island and neutralize New York City. That's from a Republican's perspective. I mean, from a Democrat perspective, they'd have a completely different outlook on that. But from my perspective, we need big, strong turnout here in upstate New York, and I've been preaching that for months and months. If you want to get rid of Andrew Cuomo, register to vote, and on election day, don't let anything stop you from voting. And I think that you are going to see a huge turnout in upstate New York, and I think this governor's worried about that, and he should be worried about that.
Even with that huge turnout, do you think it's viable that it can neutralize the New York City Democrats?
I do. I really do. And if you look no further than just a few months ago with the election for mayor in New York City, the turnout was dismal in New York City. I think, if I'm right, I think it was about 29%, if I recall. That is first of all, that's an insulting turnout to the United States of America. I mean, I don't understand how people cannot vote, but hey, if they want to stay home in New York City and not come out and vote for Andrew Cuomo, that's perfectly fine with me this time around. But I think that the turnout, the enthusiasm is not there in New York City. And the truth is, the dirty little secret inside this building, this governor's not very popular with a lot of Democrats as well. And I've said all along, very often, that his support may be a mile wide, it's about an inch deep. And there are a lot of people that don't really embrace this governor because he's not a very likable candidate and he acts like a bully far too often. So I think that you are going to see big turnout in upstate New York. I think you'll see diminished turnout in New York City. I'd be surprised if they got more than 30%. So that being said, Long Island is exceptionally important in this mix, that we do very well down there. And Long Island is suffering in a lot of areas just like upstate New York is suffering. So I think that the turnout is key, and if people rise up and turn out in upstate New York, we're going to have a new governor in come next January.
There are a lot of issues facing the legislature right now, and I guess two of the things that are really talked about are taxes and education. In City and State's legislative preview for this year, you said that one of your top priorities in 2014 is going to be education. Just in education in general, are there specific things that you're going to be looking at?
No, a lot of things. I'm married to a teacher, so and both her parents were teachers, and her sister's a teacher. We have a lot of education in the family, so we're always very focused on education. That's on a personal side. I have two kids in school, so of course, like everybody out there, we're focused on education on the personal side. On the legislative side, I'm focused on a couple of things. So one is this rollout of Common Core has been absolutely a disaster of epic proportions. I'm of the belief that you put a freeze on this for at least 2 or 3 years, and if you're going to continue with it, at least do it right and structure it correctly. There are many that believe we should do away with it, and I'm kind of that belief myself. But if we are not going to do that, we should at least hit the pause button for a couple years and do this correctly, structure correctly. That's number one. Number two is data mining. The mining of our students' data is troubling to me, and that's as kindly as I can put it, that it's troubling. I want it stopped, and I want it stopped immediately, and I don't want it to continue. There is no justification at all for uploading our students' data to a private corporation out onto the cloud or onto the web. That should be handled in-state by the state education department and by local school districts. That's number two. Number three, and these aren't in any specific particular order, even though I'm listing them, gap elimination adjustment is absolutely imperative that we focus on closing that gap, and I don't think this governor has any focus on that at all. We should close the gap elimination adjustment that our schools continue to struggle from a couple of years ago. And I believe that should be done before we move toward universal pre-K. I'm not opposed to universal pre-K. I don't think really too many people are opposed to it. But it's a matter of priorities, and it's a matter of why are we talking about universal pre-K when we don't have universal K in the state of New York? There are school districts here locally that don't have full-day kindergarten. So to me, it just logically makes sense that you would take care of universal kindergarten before focusing on universal pre-K and saddling these schools with a whole bunch more expenses. And one of the things the governor said that I was shaking my head in disbelief at the budget address was saying that universal pre-K, he projected, would cost $1.5 billion over 5 years. That's absolutely false. It's completely not true. And I'm shaking my head saying there's no way. It's at least $1.5 billion every single year. And sure enough, that's what John King came out and said the other day at an education hearing, that they estimate $1.6 billion per year. I'm not saying it's not worthy to do. I'm just saying, where's that money coming from when we have gap elimination adjustment that has to be backfilled? We have schools that are continuing to struggle to maintain their current programs. To me, it doesn't make sense to add another program before we take care of what needs to be done. So those are three big issues for me. And then, of course, there's always the battle here that goes on internally, that myself and every other legislator wants to get their quote-unquote fair share for their school. So that's an ongoing battle that all of us doing our jobs, we're all trying to get as much as we can for our local schools.
if pre-K is going to be a priority, and you're looking at that $1.5 billion number, the governor is proposing to use a $2 billion surplus, projected surplus, to fund tax cuts.
Yeah.
Would you suggest using that $2 billion to fund this pre-K instead?
Well, yeah, I would. And by the way, it's a projected surplus. He's going to spend the money now, and he's going to project maybe we're going to have a surplus out in 2016. There is no surplus. We're only in Albany, and only in this rarefied atmosphere could you somehow have a $1.7 billion deficit suddenly morph into the essence of a $2 billion surplus. There isn't a surplus. It's smoke and mirrors. That's key, that people understand that there really is no surplus. It's projected. It may happen out in the future. Probably not going to, but that's what we're dealing with right now. The other thing that should be done immediately is, why are we issuing $350 checks right before an election, by the way, in a shameless electioneering attempt? This is just pandering, is all this is. We're going to send out $350 checks, and who are we sending them to? We're sending them to people with school-aged children. Wouldn't it be a lot better to say, you know what, we're going to give that directly to the schools, and we're going to backfill that gap elimination adjustment? That will go a long way toward doing that. So I'm of the belief, and I'm a conservative Republican guy. I lean, that way. I'm not exclusively that way, but I do, lean conservative. I'm also of the belief that if you're going to cut taxes, you better really have a surplus to do it. And how are you going to pay for it? That's a common sense question. So yeah, I think that it'd be much more fiscally prudent to not proceed with a fictitious tax cut because it's a fictitious surplus, and actually really address what needs to be done. That'd be the way I'd go. But what's going to happen is we're going to send out $350 checks 2 weeks before election and say, look at us, aren't we great? It doesn't make much sense to me.
To go back to Common Core for a minute, Education Commissioner John King was at a Senate Education Committee hearing a couple weeks ago, and one of the senators said to him, don't make us as a legislature have to do something about this. Don't make us be the ones that have to put the stop to this or change this. Do you foresee the legislature, whether it's the Assembly or the Senate, bringing something forward to stop Common Core or adjust the rollout of it?
Well, I do, because so far what we've gotten from Commissioner King and from State Ed is kind of full speed ahead with little tiny slowdowns here and there. For example, supposedly we've started the upload of our kids' data. Well, that's a good thing, but that would not have occurred without this legislature yelling and screaming. So at this point, as we're filming this, I think that it's probably going to be legislative action that gets involved and puts a stop to this, or at least hits the pause button for a couple of years. And we're perfectly open and hopeful that State Ed does their job and stops this on their own, but that has not been the feedback that we've been seeing. So at this point, it looks like a legislative fix is probably going to be coming down the pipe.
On the data issue, the commissioner says that some school districts, especially in affluent areas, have been using third parties for quite a while to either store student data or as a portal system that teachers and students can access it. So instead of this third party in Bloom that they're looking at using, would you propose that the state internally come up with its own database and its own servers to store this information? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. And where Commissioner King's off base is, yes, that's true. They have been using third parties. But we have not been using a privately funded corporation by Bill Gates and company, who's also funding a lot of the Common Core. The way this is all tied together is very, very troubling. The reason they want that data is because data is money that's valuable to them as a corporation going forward. There's a reason they're collecting 400 points of data, or they want to collect 400 points of data. So absolutely, this should be done internally by State Ed. And I'm not saying that they wouldn't have to maybe use outside vendors. What I am saying is that should be held by the State Education Department and by the local districts, and the parents should have access to it. The parents should have the ability to opt out of that, which the State Ed doesn't seem to want to do. They should be able to say, you're not going to upload my child's data. This is, Commissioner King is sort of telling a half-truth there when he says that we've used outside parties. We have, but it hasn't been uploaded to the cloud. It hasn't been out there with some big corporation in Bloom, which is not accountable to really anybody. And as a matter of fact, we've just today, I heard that we're finally going to get in Bloom to show show up and testify. Well, isn't that nice? We've been paying them a heck of a lot of money here, or there's money changing hands, let's say, and it's nice that they finally deem it necessary to come up here and answer some questions, but it took the threat of a subpoena by Assemblywoman Nolan, who did a good job on that, threatened to subpoena them if they wouldn't agree to come forward and testify in front of this legislature. Now we have to wait and see if they actually show up and follow through with what they've said they're going to do. I'm hopeful that they will, because there are many of us that have some very specific questions for M. Bloom.
I've spoken with quite a few upstate residents and legislators, and the recurring theme of my conversation seems to still be gun control and the passage of the New York SAFE Act. And now that you're a very outspoken critic of that act, we're a couple weeks removed from the one-year anniversary. Where are we at this point with the SAFE Act, do you think, and do you think anything's going to happen with it, with this lawsuit that is currently pending?
I do. By the way, it's the single worst piece of legislation I've ever seen in my life, and trust me, inside this building, that's saying something. It's a horrendously poorly written piece of legislation. It was slapped together. They didn't even spell check it correctly, and as a result of that, they had pieces of it overturned by a judge already because it's so poorly written. It doesn't do anything to make anybody safer. We know that, because criminals aren't going to obey the law. All it did was attack the law-abiding citizen. And the proof of that is this: you have over 50 counties have officially opposed the SAFE Act. That's unprecedented in New York. Sheriff's Association, the state police don't like it, the VA, certainly the Second Amendment supporters who are law-abiding citizens, they don't like this either. It's an unprecedented show of opposition. All of that being said, people ask me all the time, are you going to get it repealed? And the answer is, we're not going to repeal it, because if the people inside this building honored their oath of office and honored the Constitution of the United States, they never would have passed this ridiculous law to begin with. So, that being said, they're now not going to see the error of their ways and repeal it. But that doesn't mean that all hope is lost. I believe that we are going to win in court, and that's ultimately where this is going to be settled. I think it'll be settled at the U.S. Supreme Court. So there's going to be setbacks and victories along the way, just as there was a few weeks ago when the judge ruled. There were some victories in that ruling and some defeats in that ruling, but they're only apparent. They're only kind of surface type things, because this is going to continue on. And even if those of us that are opposed to the SAFE Act, if we had gotten a complete victory from that judge, it would really be nothing to crow about, because it's just the first step in a long process. And I think it ends up in front of the U.S. Supreme Court as a McDonald-Heller type of decision. And ultimately, I think very large parts of this are going to get overturned, because I view it as unconstitutional, and I think that's how the Supreme Court is going to view it as well.
Getting to the Supreme Court could take a long amount of time, years. Do you think that before that happens, it will take the legislature not necessarily repealing or pushing for a repeal, but looking to pass tweaks to it of some kind? And do you think that passing tweaks to it is even an option?
It's not acceptable to me. I voted for none of the tweaks because that's how bad this law is. I want the whole thing gone. And if we're going to do something, and we actually could have had a common sense discussion about it, but that isn't what we got. We got this jammed down the throats of the legislature, jammed down the throats of New Yorkers by Andrew Cuomo, and that's why you're seeing people fiercely opposing this, because there was no input, there was no common sense to this at all. So I think that there may be continued tweaks, as there have been. For example, the magazine limit. I was on the floor debating the bill the day we passed it, saying that they are not going to manufacture 7-round magazines. And the answer was, well, we're New York, they're going to do it for us. And I laughed at that, as did the magazine manufacturers. They said, we're not producing 7-round magazines just because you're New York. As a result, the governor was embarrassed by that and had to backtrack and say, okay, you can have a 10-round magazine, but all of you law-abiding citizens who have never done anything wrong in your life can only load 7, even though previous to that you could load 10. I mean, it's so arbitrary and so ridiculous. And is there a criminal out there ever in the history of criminals that would say, okay, I can only load 7 because Andrew Cuomo says that's all I can do? It's a nonsense bill. It did nothing to keep anybody safer. So there may be continued tweaks to it. We will see. I think ultimately what you're going to see, and what you are seeing now, is counties saying, you have sheriffs saying we don't want to enforce this against law-abiding citizens. So there's going to be a lot of non-compliance. Same thing with the gun registration. They're going to just not comply. I don't know. I've never met a person that says they're going to comply with that and register their weapon or their firearm. They're not going to do it.
In an election year, do you still see this being an issue for especially upstate voters, and not just when it comes time to electing the governor, but also electing other Democrats and Republicans who associate with this bill?
Yeah, without question. I mean, all over the state, upstate and even downstate. I mean, I get a lot of feedback. I have a lot of people following me all over the state, all over the country, really. But downstate in the city in Long Island, there's a lot of sportsmen down there. There are a lot of people that have had enough of their rights being trampled in the middle of the night. So it's going to be an issue for, I would say, almost every candidate. It's absolutely going to be an issue in the governor's race. There's no question. It's going to be an issue in every upstate race, Republican or Democrat, and it will be a huge issue even downstate in a lot of districts. Now, all that being said, you are going to have some people, I think, that lose their position, lose their seat because of that vote. And it may be Republicans and it may be Democrats, but there is going to be a day of reckoning for those that voted for this bill. Now, there are some folks that they're perfectly safe because of a yes vote, but there are others that voted the wrong way, especially upstate New York. And I think that those citizens of upstate New York are going to send new representatives here to Albany.
Assemblyman Steve McLaughlin, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure. Good to see you. Thank you.